A reading from Isaiah. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and strip kings of their robes, to open doors before him, and the gates shall not be closed. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and riches hidden in secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I surname you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I arm you, though you do not know me, so that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is no one besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. The word of the Lord.
One of the great joys of serving at Zion is the opportunity to teach sixth graders for confirmation warm-up. It is not infrequent that there are opportunities for them to raise questions. Now, it's not always clear whether those questions are intended to broaden and strengthen the conversation or whether they are an effort to sidetrack the lesson. But whatever the case, frequently those questions open up a space for a larger conversation. Just this past Wednesday, one of the students said, "Now, have you ever read straight through the whole Bible?" And before I could offer a response, one of the others said, that isn't really how you read the Bible. Brilliant move. And it opened up for us a conversation about what the Bible is and how the Bible is actually a collection of books that are all in one cover, that it's more like a library. And to try to read it from cover to cover in the way that you would read any other book that is composed to be one document, well, it gets pretty confusing and difficult. On the other hand, when we read the scriptures in worship, what we tend to do is we cut them up into nice bite-sized pieces that we can read during a worship service without it going too long. Because if we were to read kind of the whole sweep of what was in the story, well, we would have a hard time fitting everything that we want to do to worship God into 1 hour. And perhaps you've heard the admonition, keep it to an hour, preacher. Maybe you've heard it. And so we have the challenge of, on one hand, we need to hear the large sweep of the story. On the other hand, in worship, it's hard to sit down and read the whole book. Well, today is a classic example. Today in Isaiah, we hear a piece of the story that comes really relatively late in the story. And when it comes at this point, and we just jump in, if you don't have the background, it's hard to figure out what's going on. You see, if we were to read the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, what we would hear is a prophet who is pleading and admonishing and warning the people of Judea and the people, and more so their rulers and their religious leaders, to change the way you're doing things. It's not going to go well for us if you don't do things differently. And the admonitions and the encouragement gets more and more and more, intense. Until in that 39th chapter, Well, the other thing you need to know is that Judah is down here and Jerusalem is kind of the crossroads of all the trade routes between east and west and north and south and all around. And all the roads go through there. And so everybody wants that property. And so there are all these empires around that want to get a hold of Judah. And so the kings, well, they're getting pretty anxious. And they're looking for allies wherever they can find them. And as they look for allies, they're always listening for who's willing to help us out. Well, in the 39th chapter, some envoys from a place called Babylon show up at Hezekiah's door, and they say, "Hey, we're here." And Hezekiah, anxious as he was about the security of his nation, invites them in. He shows them all around. He shows them everything that he has. Now, if we lived in an urban setting where you all had security systems just inside the door of your house, this would be the equivalent of inviting the burglar into the house, showing them all the features of your security system so that they know that you're a trustworthy partner in the security of your house. And of course, what do? They use that against you. And in fact, that's what happens. Hezekiah is almost bragging to Isaiah. These envoys from Babylon came and I showed them everything. And Isaiah says, everything? This is not going to go well. And in fact, it doesn't. The Babylonians come and they wipe everything out. They tear down the temple, but first they take all the gold and the silver and the scrolls and all the worship accoutrement and haul them off to Babylon. And then they take the leaders, the political leaders and the religious leaders and the artisans, and they take all those people, not the peasants. They need the peasants to work the land. But they take all those other people and haul them off to Babylon, and then they bring in other people, other religious leaders, political leaders, and artisans from other places that they've conquered to take those roles in Judah. That's how you did it when you were an empire, though. And so these people have been in exile for a long time. So what are the first words that we hear in the 40th chapter of Isaiah? Some of you are looking at your bulletin saying, my gosh, we read from the 45th chapter. What's it going to take him to get there? Relax. We're almost there. The first words in the 40th chapter of Isaiah, we associate them with Advent and Christmas. I bet you know them well. Comfort. Oh, comfort my people. After generations of being in exile, Isaiah starts to speak a new story, starts to offer words of comfort and hope to his people. And one of those words of comfort is what we hear today, where he says, God has sent an anointed one, Cyrus. Now, if we were reading in Hebrew, you'd all hear that anointed one actually in Hebrew is Messiah. God is sending a Messiah. God is sending one who has been chosen to work your release. Now, here's the problem. These good Jewish people who have been in exile for a whole bunch of years would expect that that would be somebody who is a good, faithful, Jewish kind of person. Somebody who's a lot like us. Somebody who worships like we do. Worships the God we do. But Cyrus? Well, first of all, geography lesson. Babylon Iraq. All right? That's where Babylon is. Guess where Persia is? Iran. So if you think that this thing between Iraq and Iran is a new thing, guess what? So, we hear from Isaiah that God has anointed, has claimed, has appointed Cyrus, the king of Persia, to come in and knock out the regime at Babylon. And he is going to do this by knocking down, the doors will just crumble in front of him. In fact, the history goes kind of like this. It suggests that Cyrus was so effective with his propaganda war ahead of time that when they showed up on the horizon, the Babylonians kind of just laid down their weapons and said, come on. All right? It could happen even then. Cyrus shows up and he treats this people who have been in exile with dignity. He sends them home. He ends the exile. More so, he funds rebuilding their country, their nation. Even bigger than that, he funds rebuilding the temple. Now, lest you think that all we have about Cyrus is in the biblical record, the truth of the matter is there are other documents. There's a scroll that, quite honestly, some scholars argue is the first historical record of a human rights manifesto. This king, Cyrus, is a good guy. But here's the problem. He's not Jewish. He doesn't even know the Jewish God. And yet somehow, he's been appointed to do God's work. This is important for us to hear. In fact, 500 years ago, a guy by the name of Martin Luther argued that, some people get all uptight about, is he Christian? And he said, I'd rather have a good ruler who isn't Christian than a scoundrel who is. Sometimes we get caught up in focusing on the wrong things. What God calls for is leadership that seeks justice, that seeks to do the right thing, to treat people with dignity. And in the midst of that, we hear that this one has been appointed. Now, maybe you heard it. Maybe you're like me, and the first time through, I don't hear things. But so Cyrus has been appointed to be an agent of God's mission. And here's what God says to Cyrus. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I arm you, though you do not know me, so that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is no one besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. And there's the promise for us. The promise is that God is God. And that God will do whatever it takes in order to do what God wills. And God will appoint or call or equip whoever God sees fit to equip to do what God needs to be done for the sake of justice, for the sake of mercy, for the sake of good leadership. But in the end, all of this has the purpose of revealing God to be who God is. Revealing the largeness of who God is and what God does. The promise for us is sure. Just as it was true for the people in Isaiah's day, that God is always working to make things good. So too it was in that day when that young rabbi was in the temple stirring things up and making people anxious and angry, and they were sending in their disciples with tricky questions about taxation. And so it is also true today that God is working in our midst to bring about the good for all creation by whatever means necessary. Sometimes it's really important that we read the whole book.